To create this monochromatic crystal swatch, I'm just going to be using plain old burnt umber. I think this is Winsor Newton brand, but most brands with this color are pretty consistent. And this is a favorite color that I love to use when making crystals. It's just a very warm toned brown. So what I like to do is start with, typically I start with my darkest area. So wherever my darkest part of my crystal is going to be, that's where I like to start. And the reason that I do that is because I have a tendency to go more intense in color than the other way around. So it really, there's no like law that says you have to start with the darker. You can totally start with the lighter, but for me it works out better to start dark because that's where I tend to go anyway. So to start off with, I'm grabbing some paint color and some water, mixing it really well. I've got a small brush that I'm using because this crystal is pretty small. And also using a small brush will help to ensure that you're not using too much water. So for me, using a bit of a smaller brush kind of helps me keep my water in check. So I load up my brush and I'm going to start here with this side. I'm going to have as my darkest one. And what I like to do is lay down color until all of that wetness is gone. You can see it just kind of scrubs out. And I grab a little water and pull the color into the whole shape. I'm not trying to be consistent. I can even grab a little more paint, especially since this is my darker side. What I really want to do at this point is get this entire shape filled in with wetness, wet color. So now what I like to do is play. So I pretend that each one of these sections is like its own little abstract painting. So I go in with little dots of water. I can come in with more intense paint, add some real dark quality to some of the edges here because this is my darker side. But you can see how always my paint is pretty wet, so you don't ever want to have like really dry paint at this point. We want this to kind of flow around and have that cool crystal effect. And a lot of times, depending on the color that you're using and the weather outside and what kind of brush you're using, some of the areas can start to dry before other areas. And most of the time I try to avoid that when I'm painting, but for crystals, it's a beautiful thing because you start to get all these little character nuances within your shape. So once I'm happy with this, then I move on to my next shape. And like I said, I just pretend that each one of these is its own little abstract painting. Now I'm still going to go sort of dark on this upper part here. So I've got some color in. I'm going to grab some water, fill in the shape. And then start to play. So I'm going to add a little darkness right over here, maybe some up here at the top. If I rinse my brush off completely and tap it on my towel, I can pull some color away if I need to. So making this area a little lighter. So those two, I'm probably going to make this down here really dark too, but for now, these are my darkest shades. So now, when I come over here, I want these to be my midtones. So I'm going to add more water to the mix that I already have here and lay that out and see what happens. So that's actually a pretty good mid-tone. And I'm going to start spreading it out into the shape. So I've got it now completely covered in wetness. I can grab drops of water, start to give it some character. I'm going to grab a little more paint to add some intensity in a few areas, but I don't want to overpower this one, because all in all, I want this to be my dark and this to be my mid-tone. So I'm going to follow that up here too. This one's going to be a bit of a mid-tone as well. Grabbing some water and pulling that color out into my shape. Adding some character. And then down here, I'm going really intense. So you can see it's still wet, but I've got a lot of paint in there as well, because I'm going to make this one really dark. In any area that is still wet, I can still continue to add color. So like this area, this darkness over here is still pretty wet, so, or not pretty wet, it's still wet. So I can still play with it, still add in some color. And then once I am happy with all of this, I'm going to now fill in my very lightest area is going to be right here. So I've got a pretty dry brush. It's just slightly damp. I'm grabbing a little bit of color right on the tip, and that was probably too much, but that's okay. So I put in a little speck of it, rinse, dab off my brush, and pull that color into this very, very light shade. And voila, I have created a monochromatic crystal swatch. That is a mouthful. So I hope you'll give these a try. It's a lot of fun and a really good way to start to understand the balance between how much water do I need, how much paint do I need to get the really intense colors, how can I get the really light colors, what happens if I add more, what happens if I add less. It's just a really good way to explore and have fun with your color.